his economy, which had begun a long downward spiral since the removal of Western capital. For help, he turned to Che Guevara, who, though an Argentinian by birth, had become a Cuban citizen. The doctor and revolutionary served in the unlikely positions of president of the National Bank and as Minister of Industry. Castro tried to run the country like one of his guerrilla camps. He organized Cubans into brigades to combat problems such as deforestation and to assist with the harvest. Castro himself participated, but neither his presence nor Che's was enough to reverse Cuba's long-term economic fortunes. Ration books were issued to help allocate scarce commodities. The consumer goods Castro hoped to receive from his Soviet sponsors never materialized in sufficient numbers to satisfy demand. The Soviets continued to subsidize Castro's experiments to improve the island's agricultural sector. Castro personally accompanied Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin on a tour of a model sugar plantation. For several years, Castro had been moving closer and closer to the Soviet political model. In 1965, he merged his July 26th movement with the Communist Party of Cuba, making the nation a one-party state. Tenemos nuestra forma de interpretar esas ideas. 2 years later, Castro's longtime revolutionary partner, Che Guevara, was killed in Bolivia, where he was working with guerrillas who wanted to extend the Cuban Revolution to South America. Leaving behind 5 children, Che became the martyr of the Cuban Revolution. For many, it was the end of an era. Until Che's death, Cuba had retained much of its pre-revolutionary verve and excitement. But shortly afterward, Castro instituted an inflexible communist regimen that seemed to slowly squeeze the life out of Cuba's vibrant society. More than 50,000 small businesses were closed. Cuba's exuberant nightlife grew dark. When compared to the buoyant revolutionary of the 1950s, Castro himself seemed to be growing somber. In 1968, Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia, crushing an anti-Soviet democracy movement. As a man caught in the trap of his alliances, Castro had no choice but to defend the actions of his economic benefactor.
We accept the harsh necessity that required the dispatch of those forces to Czechoslovakia. We do not condemn the socialist countries that made that decision.
The man who was once the darling of the anti-colonial liberation movement was defending the armed invasion of another country by his communist overlords. Castro's revolution had not freed Cuba from the economic stranglehold of a foreign power. It had merely exchanged the domination by foreign landowners and American corporations for the faceless bureaucracy of the authoritarian Soviet Union. Partido Comunista de Cuba. By the end of the 1960s, Cuba was becoming increasingly indebted to the Soviet bloc. Hoping to recapture Cuba's economic independence, Castro, in 1970, called for the largest sugar harvest in the nation's history. To reach the target of more than 10 million tons, schools, businesses, universities, and the army were all mobilized. Castro himself went into the fields. A record 8.5 million tons were collected, but the harvest still fell short of Castro's plans to liberate his economy from foreign control. From 1972 on, the Cuban economy survived thanks only to its ties to the Soviet satellite states. The communist dictator from Cuba visited with his counterparts in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary. When Castro joined the Council on Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, in 1975, Cuba became a cog in the socialist world's system of trade. Wherever Castro went, he was sure to praise Eastern European goods as wonders of socialist technology and international solidarity. At home, Castro greeted Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, the first Soviet leader to visit Latin America. 15 years after his revolution, Castro had evolved from an unbridled rebel to a functionary of the Soviet Empire beholden to the Kremlin. In 1975, Castro's elite military troops intervened in Angola in southwestern Africa. Here, Socialist President Agostinho Neto was fighting a bitter civil war against rebels backed by the white South African government. The Cuban troops fought for the next 13 years, doing the dirty work for their financial backers, the Soviet Union. At one time, more than 50,000 Cuban soldiers were fighting in Africa. The man who had earlier been the chief opponent of Western imperialism again had to follow the party line when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. During this time of personal turmoil that Castro called a sea of difficulties, his closest personal aide and confidant, Celia Sanchez, died of cancer. After her death, Castro became increasingly remote, consumed by his own thoughts and less aware of much that was going on in Cuba's daily life. Around this time, Castro became romantically involved with Delia Soto del Valle. Together they had 5 sons. Castro, however, continued his unattached lifestyle, sometimes living in a small room next to his office in the Palace of the Revolution. Life was becoming increasingly difficult for Castro. The growing economic crisis in the communist bloc had spilled over into Cuba. In 1982, short of foreign currency, Cuba defaulted on its international debts. On the Caribbean island of Grenada, Castro had been grooming Maurice Bishop, the country's socialist leader. Bishop was assassinated shortly before the island was invaded by American troops. 24 Cuban soldiers were killed, and more than 700 were taken prisoner in Grenada. It was Castro's first military defeat. In Moscow, after years of hardline communist leadership, control of the Kremlin had passed to reformer Mikhail Gorbachev. Castro's relations with the architect of perestroika were not as warm as they had been with previous Soviet leaders. Ironically, just months before the Berlin Wall toppled in Germany, Castro and Gorbachev signed a pact that aligned the Soviet Union and Cuba for the next 25 years. Castro was not blind to the enormous changes that were taking place on the world political map, as one by one, his former communist allies rejected Moscow and began their ongoing experiments with democracy.
We must now face the crisis that has emerged within the socialist camp, from which we can only expect negative consequences for the economy of our country.